Tisztelt Államtitkár úr, tisztelt Hölgyeim és
Mr. State Secretary, ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, members of the various delegations, foreign delegations, I would like to welcome everybody on behalf of the Center for Fundamental Rights at today's event, which is going to revisit the topic of migration challenges in the US and Hungary. This is the title of the event, and this is what we're going to be talking about. My name is Veronika Horváth, and I am going to be the host of today's event. First of all, I would like to respectfully ask, on behalf of the Center for Fundamental Rights, Péter Törcsik, our operative director, to deliver his opening remarks. Honorable Secretary of State, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to today's conference event. Most probably the most important piece of message of today's event as regards migration challenges in the US and Hungary is that no matter how far away the US and the EU are geographically from each other, we may feel that we actually face the same challenges or very similar ones, be it for Hungary or for the US, and it's also very obvious that the similar challenges are met by similar solutions by American conservatives and Hungarian conservatives. We find very similar solutions, and obviously migration and the question of illegal migration is such a topic, such an issue. Under the Orbán governance, Hungary constructed a fence on the southern border of Hungary to protect Hungary, both legally and physically, and through that Europe too, against people coming from illegal migrants coming by the millions into Hungary and into the EU, and thus causing havoc in our society. And between 2016 and 2020, under the Trump administration, the US started building a border fence, a border wall, on the US-Mexican border to protect America with physical means, not just legal means, from the mass of illegal migrants which aims to enter the territory of the US from the direction of Mexico. And there's another very important piece of message of today's event, namely that between the Hungarian and US conservatives, the relationship is not just superficial, but we also kicked off strategic partnerships and relationships. We at the Center for Fundamental Rights, together with the US relevant institutions, so welcome to Robert Law from the America First Policy Institute, and we've built a very good relationship, and we are working on a common project with the AFPI, which is aimed at comparing the various solutions offered for the problem of migration, how to prevent this problem in the American continent and the EU, how we should actually share the various legal solutions which actually borne fruit on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. And there's another very important aspect of the US-Hungarian cooperation. Migration, gender and family-related policies in these two countries are values which are common to us. And it may seem from the Western world that outside of it there may be some societies who have traditional approaches to the values which we actually share and are committed to, and the roots of which stem from the Judeo-Christian culture. But the difference between these two worlds is that no matter how distorted the Western world is, thanks to the progressive masses, it still remains a free world, and the world outside of the Western world hasn't been as free as the EU or the US. And the freedom that binds us together also gives us a responsibility in terms of finding solutions to the problems that come outside of the Western world or from within, and we should actually together seek solutions to these problems. Obviously, we would like to contribute to finding solutions with our moderate means, through our cooperation with the AFPI, and I do think that there's more commonalities between the US and Hungary than the things that divide us, despite the fact that the current US ambassador and the democratic government not thinking of us as an ally, and hopefully we are going to be allies after this November, and we can actually demonstrate this friendship between the US and Hungary on a day-to-day basis. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and now I would like to give the floor over to the State Secretary. Thank you very much. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, special welcome to Robert Law and everybody in attendance. Thank you, Mr. Law, for coming to Hungary and cooperating with our colleagues, and obviously I would like to thank the invitation for the Center for Fundamental Rights. I think this is a very topical issue, and from a decade-long perspective we actually see that uncontrolled illegal migration may cause unforeseeable consequences, and it is very difficult to grapple this problem. It's very difficult to find common ground because of the differing stances assumed by the various actors in the international arena. But before addressing Hungary's stance on the matter, shortly I would like to evaluate the US-Hungarian relations. Obviously, it's got great traditions, but the present is quite bitter, if I may say, because of the fact that in many areas where we could find common ground, we fail doing so. And it's not just political and ideological differences which drive a wedge between us, because pragmatically speaking, we could actually find a way forward very easily. But what we see is that there's no receptiveness from the part of the US. Economically, obviously, the relations are very intense. The US corporations are very interested in making investments in Hungary, and I have to say that in the field of defense policy and military policy, the ties between the two countries are very close and very strong. We have to state that defense cooperation between the US and Hungary, obviously we are allies with one another, is very strong. And I also need to add that Hungary is a reliable partner within the NATO framework, and strengthening the eastern flank of the NATO, and in doing so we've been supporting Baltic countries, Romania, and we've been doing everything to strengthen NATO, to reinforce the alliance, and to make the deterrence power of NATO as credible as possible. And obviously we've increased defense spending GDP-wise to 2%. We also participate in airspace control activities in the Baltic region. We've been doing so for several years now, so there are a number of contributions which should call for recognition from our counterparts, but it seems that this recognition is missing. And I needed to give you this introduction because migration is an issue which affects both of these countries in a very similar way. Obviously, the US is a traditionally popular destination country for migrants. Obviously, the very strong image of the US was built on this notion, but what we are faced with is something completely different. It's something very dangerous, because masses of people, tens of thousands, may be able to make their way into the US without undergoing any sort of checks, and Hungary in 2015 experienced something very similar. And obviously we've been subjected to this pressure and challenge, or even threat, ever since, when 500,000 people crossed the Hungarian border and went through the country without paying regard to our laws, to conventions, I think that after a long time the Hungarian society met a very severe threat. Such a huge mass of people came into the country, even if temporarily, that we simply couldn't manage. That is why it was very much necessary for the Hungarian government to create a policy on that. There are three pillars to it, and we need to reiterate these three rational pillars through which Hungary wants to address the issue of illegal migration. The first and probably the most important is that we have to protect our external borders. And this is not only because there's mounting pressure on the border, but also because we have international obligations within the framework of the Schengen Agreement. Obviously, we have an external Schengen border, and in order for the internal system to operate appropriately and to provide free movement within the Schengen area, we have to protect our external borders. But when we put up the fence, when we constructed it and deployed military personnel and policemen on the border stretch, we've been criticized very harshly. We were criticized very harshly from EU partners and other allies, despite the fact that we actually protect them too, because Hungary is not a primary destination country of migrants. Those who come from the direction of Serbia to Hungary want to make their way further inside into the EU and, in some cases, obviously to the US too. So, first is protection of the external border. The second is that we shouldn't decide who's entitled for a refugee status when they've already crossed the border, but we have to find a solution to this issue when they are at the border, because there are big differences between migrants and migrants. One type of these migrants who cross 4 to 5 safe countries, maybe EU countries, by the time they get to Hungary. So in relation to these people, based on the Geneva Agreement, the refugee law doesn't apply to these people because they, by the time they arrive at the Hungarian border, will have crossed a number of safe countries. And on the other hand, there are people coming from Ukraine, coming from a war-torn country, and obviously, as the first safe country, they may arrive into Hungary, Poland, or maybe even cross to Slovakia. So these people are actually legitimate refugees. They are entitled to care. So the Hungarian government obviously welcomed these people with open arms, embraced them. The third pillar, this was the second one, the third is that the problem shouldn't be brought into Hungary, but we should take help to where the problem was triggered. And in this respect, Hungary has been doing as much as possible within the framework of the Hungary Helps program from the Middle East to Africa. We've been carrying out certain activities, and we also want to launch missions like the one in Chad, which has got a humanitarian, a development and an economic element, as well as a military one, so as to increase the resilience capabilities of the countries. But the first and most important thing, as I've already mentioned, is to protect the external borders. If we take a view of these three pillars, then it becomes obvious that addressing the Hungarian and the US problem, logically speaking, should be very similar. However, the problem is that the current American administration doesn't see eye to eye with us, so we cannot create a strong collaboration between the two of us. It's also very characteristic that the three pillars, which have been built by the Hungarian government since 2015, no matter what sort of criticism we received, we actually found out that over the 9 years that passed since then, the mainstream EU thinking came very close to Hungarian thinking. So the stance, the position of Western European countries approximated very much the Hungarian positions. Many people want to strengthen the factors that attract people from countries of origin, But they still don't recognize the importance of strengthening the borders and managing migration. So the possible solutions to this, so obviously it is going to give us economic problems if people in so great numbers come to our countries. There's also public safety concerns, possibly caused by great masses of people appearing overnight in countries, and obviously these people are unable to set their foot on the labor market. They don't have anything to do within the countries. Police forces are unable to uphold public order. So this is again a problem they may cause. A third problem is very rapid cultural change that may be triggered by the appearance of these great number of people. We simply don't want the Hungarian society over the course of 10 to 15, 20 years to undergo fundamental cultural changes, because this country in this geographical region has a 1,000-year-old tradition and history, and we have a historical heritage that we have to protect and take care of. And if a large group of people change the status quo, then the characteristics of the Hungarian society will change, and we simply don't want that. Fourth thing is terrorism. Unchecked migration provides a protective umbrella to terrorists. They can actually exploit huge migratory flows. You can exploit unchecked border crossings, and we've seen since 2015 that the perpetrators actually exploited these security flaws, moved freely within the Schengen area, and their accomplices arrived through the borders into the EU. Obviously, this once again will have unforeseeable consequences, and there's a quite great degree of anti-Semitic sentiment in Western European countries and in the US too, which got out of hand by now, and the tensions within certain societies were exacerbated so much that it is simply impossible for governments and societies to combat these tensions and problems. That is why we in Hungary announced zero tolerance against anti-Semitism. We simply disallowed protests which could actually turn into such protests, and the Hungarian government will do everything in its power to uphold public order. So through these measures and steps taken, we can actually see that it does matter what sort of migrants we take into Hungary. If such people come to our borders who have nothing to do here, we are going to deny entrance to Hungary. And until we have the government that is currently in place, no changes will be made to these policies. We are not going to collaborate with those people who want any change in this respect, because we think that it is part of our sovereignty to oversee the changes in our societies and to guarantee the safety of our society. We do trust that in relation to our collaboration with the US, a time may come in the near future when we will have an easier time collaborating with the incumbent government. I think we have common interests, and despite the differences, we could definitely serve as allies for one another. And I do think that it lies in our interests to have a Trump government, because they think very similarly to us. We will see what this year's elections will bring, but we do hope that once again an age will come, where the US and Hungary could collaborate more closely on the topic of illegal migration and help one another. Thank you very much for the invitation, and obviously I wish you a very fruitful and interesting panel discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Péter Sztáray, State Secretary, responsible for defense policies. And now we are going to have the panel discussion. First of all, I would like to ask Mr. Robert Law, Director of the Center for Homeland Security and Immigration at the America First Policy Institute. So I would like Mr. Law, please come to the stage. And just a technical piece of information, the discussion is going to be in English, so if you need Hungarian interpretation, then please take a headset from the table next to the window. And as usual, I would like to ask Mr. Zoltán Koskovics, geopolitical analyst at the Center for Fundamental Rights, to also come up to the stage.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for such a great interest for our discussion and event dealing with the dangers of migration. And I would like to extend my gratitude to Rob Law, who joined us representing the America First Policy Institute. Welcome to Budapest, Rob.
Well, thank you so much. I'd like to thank my friends at the Center for Fundamental Rights for their very generous offer and hospitality to show me around, see firsthand what the situation is in Hungary, an opportunity to learn, to collaborate. I'd also like to just thank everyone for coming out. I apologize for my lack of ability to speak Hungarian. I struggle enough with English, so I'm always in awe with the seeming ease that so many Europeans seem to be able to pick up numerous languages. So again, thank you so much for coming. I look forward to the dialogue.
I assure you, Rob, nobody's expecting you to speak Hungarian. That was a joke that Pope Francis made about this, that we are all going to speak Hungarian in heaven, because it takes an eternity to learn it.
That's good. That's far more clever than my line.
Well, let's start a little bit with politics before we go on to migration. The two are obviously connected. The primary season is basically over. Donald Trump is the de facto or presumptive GOP nominee. Were you surprised at how easily he won this race?
Sure, and just to sort of be clear, the America First Policy Institute, we don't engage in politics, but policies. However, it is unsurprising that President Trump, he is the leader of the America First movement, and there's really no bigger champion of that. And so, to me, I thought the primary campaign, while short, I thought it was healthy. I think it's good for American democracy. But I'm also not surprised with how quickly President Trump secured the nomination, because with President Trump, you have a track record from not that long ago of just how successful America First policies can be for the American people up and down the economic ladder, as well as whatever your demographics are. And so we have a unique time in American history where you have the former president facing off against the current president. Only one time in our young country's history has there been a situation where a president had two non-consecutive terms. And so again, you have such a clear contrast that you have the America First champion in Donald Trump, and then you have what I tend to call the America Last champion, if you will, in current President Joe Biden.
Let's talk a little bit about AFPI, the America First Policy Institute. It was founded in 21, and it seems obvious from the name, and I know you guys, that you are working on a program for the second Trump presidency. Who are you guys? What are your main objectives, and how will it be connected to the, let's hope, next term of Donald Trump?
Sure, yes. So the America First Policy Institute, or AFPI as we're often known by shorthand, really is the philosophical vision of what President Trump's second term was going to look like had the 2020 election gone differently. And so you have a number of senior cabinet officials and other White House leaders, as well as dozens of other officials who served in administration capacities at various parts of the federal government, who loved what we were doing, were not ready to be done, felt that we had a compelling policy vision that the American people wanted to hear more of. And so we took those plans that we couldn't implement in government and established this new organization, the America First Policy Institute, to articulate them from the outside, make a compelling case for why it is you need an administration that adheres to those. And so from the top down, we are a very unique think tank in Washington, D.C., where we have so many people that have served in numerous capacities in the federal government, serving for President Trump as well as previous Republican administrations, and really having that firsthand experience of leadership, of having to make decisions, having to deal with what President Trump calls the deep state, the federal employees who seem to oftentimes impede the will of the American people by kind of almost serving as a veto of the policies that President Trump wanted done in his first term. And so, you know, we're relatively young, but we touch on every policy issue under the sun. You know, I handle border security along with Chad Wolf, who was the former acting secretary of Homeland Security. You know, but we have expertise in healthcare, economic issues, religious freedoms, fighting back against woke ideology in the United States. And so again, our real strong suit is we've been there, we've governed, so we know that these are not just policies to talk about in an academic forum and hypothetical. We know what works. We know some things that didn't work as well as we thought, and how you can improve upon those concepts and turn those into policies that you can actually implement when you're back in power.
Well, everybody sort of knows this, but I think it's worth reminding people that the federal government is a behemoth. It's thousands upon thousands of people involved, and many of them are very decent people who are just trying to make life a little bit easier for the American people. Well, what we saw in President Trump's first four-year term was that a lot of this behemoth, the people involved in it, were out to sabotage his policies. Are there any plans as to how to get these people to actually obey the will of the people and help the president proceed with his policies? What are your plans for the next 4 years of Trump?
Well, you certainly cannot overstate just how massive the bureaucracy is in the United States. The answer is never to cut, it is always to expand. And what you often see is you have duplication of effort, duplication of responsibilities, and it just leads to inefficiencies. And what we saw is that unlike the private sector in the United States, where you can basically be fired at will, you also have the flexibility to leave your job at will. Say you have lost interest in it, you have an opportunity to make more money doing something else, you just want to move, you have that flexibility. When it comes to the federal government in the United States, it is almost impossible to remove somebody sort of under the long-standing view of how federal employees are. It's almost like life tenure, which is rather remarkable that you can have a position where you've never had your name on a ballot, the American people don't know who you are, and yet you can have such a significant impact on policy.
It's almost as if it was like Brussels.
Almost. They may have picked up a few things from our rather expanding government in a very short window of time. But there was a policy that President Trump signed towards the very end of his term. It was called Schedule F, which is just a technical thing. And essentially it said that if you are a federal employee, if you are part of the deep state, and you are involved in the policy-making process, you can be subject to being removed if you do not follow the lawful orders of your political superiors. Of course, much like many of the other successful Trump administration policies, this was very quickly undone by President Biden and his team. And having gone through a multi-year process to sort of figure out how to make that policy work, those of us who have been contributing to what we call transition work, effort to inform the incumbent, the incoming, excuse me, presidency. They get to decide what to do, but some suggestions. We have plans that would show them if they wanted to bring back that policy to essentially create at-will government employees to prevent them from undermining it. It really puts the bureaucracy on notice that you are either going to implement the president's policies, because he was the one who was elected by the American people, or you're going to face consequences. And just using some personal examples very, very quickly is what I saw with the attorneys at the Department of Homeland Security was they didn't like the policies that we were implementing. And they would raise what they said was a legal objection. You cannot do that. Why not? I'm also an attorney. Tell me why we cannot do that. Oh, you don't like it. But they would raise these legal objections that were really policy objections, and that's not their role. The role of an attorney, and I always had to remind them this, is I was the policy chief. I was in charge of implementing the president's agenda when it came to immigration and border security. I'm the client, I'm the boss. Your job is to ensure that any vulnerabilities are covered, but beyond that, I don't care if you don't like it, do not care if it is a high risk of litigation, which of course under the Trump administration, everything was at risk of woke NGOs suing, no matter how plain the law was that the policy was adhering to. And it was just delay tactics. And so policies or rules that should have taken months were taking years, until we kind of wised up and learned from that and kind of found ways to navigate around it. But there are certain elements of the law that were crystal clear, and policies were put in place that adhered to the very clear letter of the law, and still objection after objection after objection. Now, meanwhile, by comparison, you see a bureaucracy that seems to fully embrace the Biden administration policies. They are blatantly violating numerous laws, in particular what I know best, our migration and border security laws. Where are those same career attorneys saying, oh, you can't do that, that doesn't comply with the law, oh, that's a very high litigation risk. There seems to be none of that, and their policies, which are largely unlawful, they're definitely bad policy, and many of them also violate US law, we're coming out at record speed, especially in the first year. And so it just goes to show that while there are many commendable, patriotic career employees, there's enough of that element that clearly have a progressive mindset and feel that it is their job to impose their values, their beliefs, instead of those of the president, who is really in charge and calling on the shots.
I think we are very safe saying that the progressive left in Europe and in the United States are basically identical. What you've just described is exactly true for the European Union, the Eurocrats, with the exact same problems. What is also very similar, of course, is the specific issue of why we've gathered here, is the dangers of migration. Europe is facing a migration crisis as well as the United States. Now, we remember that during Donald Trump's 4-year term, the president realized the gravity of the crisis, and he tried to act. And he was obviously sabotaged throughout his entire term, basically. Is this why that the problem was not addressed and never solved? Is this why migration became the most important election concern for the American people, which is, by the way, extremely unusual? Typically, it's the economy.
Well, it certainly is unusual that currently the American voter is ranking immigration, migration, and border security the #1 issue. But just to sort of rewind the clock back to 2017, when the Trump administration first kicked off, the numbers of illegal migrants crossing the border were so small in comparison to what we see today and have seen for 3 years. And yet, what you saw with President Trump and his administration was that we were upfront with the American people. We said we had a crisis. It was unacceptable. We were having between 50 to 80,000 illegal migrants a month coming across the border at certain times. That was at the high end of it. By comparison, under this administration, they are averaging over 200,000 illegal migrants a month. Several months recently, we have exceeded 300,000. It's unfathomable how many people have been allowed in under the current policies. But again, going back to all the obstacles that were put in place, there's a very clear authority that President Trump used to prevent nationals from countries that we were concerned about the ability to vet them properly. These were countries that had associations with terrorism or other sorts of threats, and we couldn't trust their government databases. And so he issued, it was called a travel ban. The media derided it as a Muslim ban, which it was not. And even though the law was very clear that the president could use this authority, that in fact previous presidents had used that authority, a single liberal judge in Hawaii, which is an island state, who, for those not too familiar with the American geography, is about as far away as you possibly could be from the continental 48 U.S., the furthest you could possibly be from Washington, D.C.
Difficult to swim there.
A little difficult to swim there. Not too many unlawful migrants showing up in Hawaii, but that one judge put that policy on hold while we had to go through the courts. It eventually went to the Supreme Court, and President Trump, of course, prevailed, but in the meantime, nationals of those countries were allowed to continue to show up at our country. Fortunately, there was nothing bad that manifested as a result of it, but every single policy faced litigation. And when we finally got around to defending the merits of these policies, we won almost every single time. But the name of the game was not, these are unlawful policies. It was, let's delay, let's see if we can run out the clock on and make Trump a one-term president, and these policies don't really get to go into effect. And I think that, again, applying lessons learned, I don't think that the administration expected that, how organized the left was in finding plaintiffs to sue, how abusive the courts would use what we call nationwide injunctions, which means you cannot do this policy until the courts have given a final answer. And so again, the apparatus that we got there year over year over year, in 2019, I'd say was by far the best year of the Trump administration writ large, and we were really heading in the right direction until COVID upended everything. But that's why I am optimistic that in the event that we are given the opportunity to have a second Trump term, that you will see a far more prepared team ready to go on day one, ready to fight back against the inevitable challenges to all of the lawful policies, and that you will not see a repeat of some of those same mistakes.
Just out of pure curiosity, were there NGO groups who helped organize these migrants get to your borders, then help them with litigation, maybe coach them what to say to the authorities? Did you have any of that?
Oh, absolutely. So of course we had NGOs that were bringing the lawsuits, but you also had NGOs that were providing safe haven. A lot of the NGOs who shield themselves in religious sounding names like U.S. Catholic Charities. Yet their mission seems to be provide locations that they would not allow immigration enforcement officials to enter to apprehend an unlawful migrant who had been ordered by a judge to go home, essentially nullifying our federal immigration laws. They've become more brazen under the Biden administration. They are receiving American taxpayer dollars, so we are funding our border invasion. And they're even now going to the Mexican side of the border and essentially providing the roadmap to commit asylum fraud. Here's what you need to say when you turn yourself into the Border Patrol. They're not trying to evade Border Patrol. They want to be apprehended because the terrain of the U.S. southern border is very rough. It is largely a desert. It is very remote. It is harsh. And so they want to be apprehended as quickly as possible, knowing that under Biden administration policies, if you say the right buzzwords, which the NGOs help with the coaching, you will very quickly be transported into a border town. You'll be then connected with an NGO representative who's right there, and there they are with preloaded cards with money on it. Again, taxpayer-funded dollars, You'll be given a plane ticket, a train ticket, oftentimes food, clothing, shelter. It is incredibly outrageous to see how the American taxpayer has become unwillingly complicit in our border invasion because of the role of the NGOs. And so that is definitely an issue that people who are trying to advise a hypothetical transition into a new administration, this case being a Trump second term, say, how can you handle these NGOs? How can you cut off that funding? How can you reroute that money to enforcement purposes? Because there are NGOs that do enforcement-minded work or assist state and local law enforcement as well. And so you see it as a very organized structure, both with our Mexican cartels, who are public enemy number one to the United States, the human smuggling and trafficking networks, and then, of course, the NGOs, who are very complicit in it as well.
So again, this is going to be a returning feature, I think, of today's discussion. That is exactly what's happening here in Europe, as we all know. The activist NGOs are actually leading the effort to bring more and more migrants to the borders of Europe, and they are gaming the system exactly like they are doing it in the United States, and they are deploying the same tools of lawfare that we see here, over there as well. Things have gotten worse in the last 4 years, much worse. But how much has the crisis deepened under the Biden administration? What are some of the things that he did to make things worse?
Well, it's exponentially worse. As I kind of alluded to earlier, what the Trump administration called a crisis, we were talking 80, 100,000 illegal migrants. That was at a single month, one single month, and we call that an absolute crisis. And it was. That would be the best month under the Biden administration. And so not to get too bogged down in the numbers, but in just 3 years, more than 11 million unlawful migrants have crossed a United States border. Largely the southern border. Some have been flown in by this administration through a scheme that they've cooked up to try to hide the numbers, but if you know where to look, you can find them there as well. I believe that's a population larger than the total population of Hungary. Not all of them remain, but most of them do. And so what you saw by the end of Trump's term was the most secure border in the United States nation's history. Within the first 100 days of the Biden administration, they had taken 94 different executive actions to undo, dismantle, and destroy successful, proven, and popular Trump administration border policies. And so the invasion that has occurred since is ongoing, is not just a humanitarian, but it is a security crisis as well. And for about the first year or so, the Biden administration bragged about how quickly and by how numerous they had taken all these actions. There are reports that were glowing about how efficient they were in erasing Trump's immigration record. They'd go on TV and say that it would take all day, or days even, to list off them all. But as the American people started to pay attention, because all of their local communities were being overwhelmed, as the border crisis stopped impacting just Texas and Arizona, but really converted every state into a border state. Once the American people were tuned into that, they couldn't hide behind it anymore. And so that's when the excuses started to happen. And so we went very quickly from denying the existence of a crisis to, it's a crisis, but it's Trump's fault, even though he's been not been the president for the last several years. It's Congress's fault because they didn't give us more money. They haven't changed the law in many, many years. The inconvenient truth for the Biden administration is that the very laws that President Trump used to implement all of his policies on the border, they're still available. Congress didn't revoke any of those. They're still there. The Biden administration just refuses to use them. The money claim is also, it's a lie. Let's just be blunt about this. It's not a resources problem at the southern border, it's a policy problem. They only want that money and new personnel, regardless of what you call them. They say, oh, we want Border Patrol agents. Well, what are Border Patrol agents doing? More than 70% of Border Patrol agents are not patrolling the border, but they are many miles away processing migrants. And that's all the Biden administration wants the money for, is to streamline the process of getting them out of federal Border Patrol custody and releasing them into American communities. And so again, it's not a resources problem, it's a policy problem. I think the American people are well aware of all of that now, and that's why this issue has leaped to the top. You know, for me, I don't want to go how long, too many years, 12, 13 years I've been doing border security immigration work. I'm always like, why is this issue not polling high enough? It's so important, it touches on so many aspects of life, you know, public safety, public education, healthcare, you name it. People need to start thinking about it, not in a silo, but how it impacts everything. And now here it is. It's at the top. And I regret that it is for the reasons that it is. Nobody wants to see our nation being basically eroded and corroded through mass unlawful migration. But this is an opportunity. You have no clearer separation, I think, in the policy positions of President Trump and President Biden than you see with border security. And it's clearly on the ballot. It's right now the issue that, you know, Biden is underwater, which means he's polling poorly in basically every single issue, but particularly so when it comes to the border issue. And so as long as that remains front and center, there will be, I think, political consequences for the absolute policy failures.
I think this is a right moment for a little bit of a tangent that our fans of America will enjoy, because it's a quirk of the American system that we don't really have here in Europe. It's very interesting. It's also tragic in a sense, but it's also comical, or has produced at least comical moments recently, and I'm talking about the sanctuary cities. What are these things, and how much do sanctuary cities enjoy when they are actually used as sanctuaries by large numbers of migrants?
Sure, that's a great question. And so for the United States, if an issue area is a federal responsibility, federal law is supposed to control. That means you have a uniform law, uniform policy, no matter what state you live in. But under the US Constitution, if you have an issue that is not reserved for the federal government, then it is sent to the states. And so you may have a patchwork approach. You know, California may have a view on a particular issue that's a state responsibility that looks very different from Alabama. For those two examples, that's probably one of the most extreme far left and the most conservative state in the United States. Well, immigration is clearly a federal responsibility, and so that means you need to have a uniform application of the law. Where sanctuary cities started popping up was this decision to say that we are going to nullify federal immigration law. We are going to shield illegal aliens from the consequences of violating US immigration law. And so they started before the Trump administration, but you know, the efforts really amplified during the Trump administration. And what this looked like was you would have an illegal migrant, largely one who had probably made an asylum claim that was fraudulent, finally went before an immigration judge and was told, you have no right to be in this country, your claim has no basis, you need to go. And then they would typically find themselves in one of these sanctuary jurisdictions. And when you would have the Immigration Customs Enforcement, or ICE as we call them, try to apprehend this unlawful migrant to deport them, which is what the law orders, the state wouldn't cooperate. They would not tell the federal immigration officials where they are. Similar to the example with the Catholic Charities, they would forbid access to certain parts of the state. One of the most egregious examples was when you would have a criminal unlawful migrant in a state jail. There they are, they're detained, you know exactly where they are. And these sanctuary states would cut them loose. They wouldn't tell ICE under the Trump administration that they had them. They would cut them loose before federal officials could show up to get them. And so they were literally putting criminals back on the street and thinking that somehow that they were having the moral high ground for that regard. And much like the criminality, regardless of your citizenship status in the United States, you seem to have a lot of repeat offenders. And so, surprise, surprise, there were some pretty high profile and tragic examples of criminal unlawful aliens in sanctuary cities who, murdered, raped, and committed other crimes against law-abiding American citizens. And so from their perspective, it was very fashionable to stand up against Trump because Trump was so awful, he's mean, he uses harsh language, we don't like all of that. Well, when Biden opened our border to a record number of unlawful migrants, and you saw the Texas governor in particular say, you're a sanctuary, you want them, you can have them. So he started busing them to these sanctuary jurisdictions, most notably New York City, which is the largest city in the United States. Population, I think it's roughly 12 million. And with only a drop in the bucket, 50,000, maybe 100,000 got there, all of a sudden the mayor of New York City, who once bragged about these sanctuary policies, says it's crippling our city. We cannot survive. We cannot survive with all these unlawful migrants. Well, perhaps you should get rid of that sanctuary policy as a starting point, stop giving away special benefits to illegal migrants, and then how about you start cooperating with immigration enforcement when you have an administration that is actually serious about doing so. So it's a little remarkable how quickly the pain that mass unlawful migration can impose when it's front and center at your doorstep. And again, New York City is suffering, Chicago, and frankly, those progressive leaders of those cities have really become almost a better vocal advocate for why the current administration policies in the United States are not working for the American people. It's one thing for former Trump administration officials to say, this is bad policy, this is America last. But when you have somebody from the same political affiliation as the president saying, these don't work, these are hurting our citizens, we are diverting resources away from overtime for police and fire, and schools have been shut down, and our children have been forced to do that remote learning that failed them during COVID in order for schools to become the new housing grounds of unlawful migrants. If you want to activate a new political base, piss off a parent. They care very much about the well-being of their children, and there's just so many examples of that that I am cautiously optimistic that sanctuary cities will be a thing of the past, but we'll see what happens.
Well, New York has already cried uncle. That's one thing. But the funniest example of this was a small place in the United States. Imagine the richest island you can. It's Martha's Vineyard. It's the highest of the high of the liberal elite live there or have holiday homes there. Barack Obama famously has one. And then Ron DeSantis flew a small plane load of migrants onto Martha's Vineyards. How long did it take them to get rid of them? 48 hours?
Oh, it was quicker than that. We're talking how many? 50. It was 50 total unlawful migrants that Governor DeSantis sent to Martha's Vineyard. And a lot of them, from a philosophy standpoint, say, we are okay with open borders on unlawful migration, but don't show up at our summer residence. They mobilized very quickly and removed those 50 unlawful migrants. It was really a self-own of pretty epic proportions.
Liberals are liberals everywhere in the United States and in Europe. Okay, but liberals, no, there was, hopefully there will be very soon a formerly democratic controlled Senate. This year it is still controlled by the Democrat Party, and there was an attempt to pass a so-called border security bill there, which was voted for by most Democrats, but it still did not pass a Democrat-controlled Senate. What happened there, and why didn't the conservatives support it?
Well, unfortunately, it was just a flawed bill from the start. To put a couple of things in perspective as to what was wrong with that bill, it would have allowed for 5,000 unlawful migrant crossings per day. a story that we often try to share to try to contextualize what that means is under President Obama, his Homeland Security Secretary said that 1,000 unlawful migrants a day was a crisis that would overwhelm and cripple the system.
And it is a crisis if you multiply it by 365, by the way.
Absolutely, and so the Senate would have normalized 5 times crisis level. Now, I don't have a strong enough command of the English language to know what 5x crisis means, but it's bad. Catastrophic might be up there. There's probably a few other words as well. That's 1.8 million unlawful migrants per year. Another problem with that, which I think hits home for the American people the most right now, is that Senate bill would have mandated what's known as catch and release. And it's very similar to what I was describing earlier. Unlawful migrant surrenders to Border Patrol, and instead of detaining them in custody or basically pushing them back, make them wait in Mexico, as we were doing during the Trump administration, they were being released into the American community of their choice. This is a policy that is in violation of current law. It is also the policy that the high-profile murderer of the Georgia College student, Laken Riley, that I'm not sure if that is global news, but it's certainly major news in the United States. He surrendered himself at the border. He's not one of the people, what we call gotaways, who tried to evade the Border Patrol. He knew how to follow the asylum fraud system, knew about catch and release. And so the Senate bill would have established that across the board. And again, if the catch and release policy was not in place, Laken Riley would still be alive today. And so again, as we talked about before, there are enough authorities already in current law that Congress does not need to send the president a single new word or piece of paper to change things. You need to have the political will to do so. And tragically for the American people, this administration has no desire to do so.
You've mentioned this before, but let's stress this. The president right now has the authority to close the southern border, right? So he does not need any more legislation to help him do that.
Well, that's absolutely right. So again, the Remain in Mexico policy, its effectiveness was as simple as the name. If you made an asylum claim at the border, you waited in Mexico until your immigration court date. When presented that option, most migrants said, I would like to remove my claim and I would like to be sent home, because they didn't want to wait in Mexico, because they knew they did not have a valid claim, but they were aspiring to be released. That authority is there. It's discretionary, which means you have the option to use it, and Biden continues to refuse to use it. It has been the law for almost 20 years now to build a wall across our entire southern border. And yet on the first day of the Biden administration, they canceled existing plans to continue the construction of the border wall system that President Trump had established. I think it was about 450 or so miles of the most advanced border security system, 30-foot rebar reinforced wall with surveillance capacity, fiber optic cables, access roads for Border Patrol agents. Plans were in place. All of that was canceled. A lot of the material was allowed to basically waste away in the desert sun, and then when people found out about that, the Biden administration sold off all of the material that had already been purchased by the American taxpayers at pennies to the US dollar. That's a bad deal by any standard, even by government standard. That again is something that they could do again. They could, of course, detain people. They could deport people. Right now, about 4% of unlawful migrants are being removed from the United States. So there continues to be a overflow coming in and a trickle, to be generous, about what is coming out. And so the balance there is off. Again, you don't need Congress to deport illegal aliens. That's another authority already on the books. You have the same, that travel ban authority could also be applied at the southern border. Just say it is detrimental to the interests of the United States. That's the key phrase. And clearly mass unlawful migration is detrimental to the interests of the United States, as well as to Hungary and frankly any other country. that authority could be used to essentially shut down the border as well. So again, the tools are there. The current administration refuses to use them.
Do you have an estimate of how many people Biden let into the country illegally?
Yeah, unlawfully, yeah, we're looking right now about 11 million in 3 years.
More than Hungary. More than Hungary.
Yeah, so probably of that, about 7 million remain. Some of them were turned away quickly at the very beginning of 2021 when our COVID public health authority was in place. It was called Title 42. That allowed you to basically, to go back. But pretty much once that was taken away in May of last year, pretty much if you show up at the southern border, you are being allowed in. And that's, all that does is generate massive profits to the cartels and the human smugglers and human traffickers, and it sends a signal to the next wave. Please come now if you want, because it's never been easier. And this is not a phenomenon that is limited to just Mexicans or those from Central American countries, the closest in geographic proximity that was typical of our illegal migration problem. The United States is now experiencing mass unlawful migration from 170 different nations. So this is not about unique circumstances in any one particular country. The unique circumstance is the Biden administration's absolute refusal to enforce the law to protect the sovereignty of the United States and defend our homeland.
There's a group of people in the United States. They're a very special group of people. I think many of us could agree on calling them honorary Hungarians. I'm speaking about the Texans. You are familiar with the nation, I believe. Now, Texas is doing something different, something. They are standing up for themselves, their own laws, and they're fighting the federal center, much like in Europe. Hungary is often in a conflict with Brussels over protecting our borders. In the same way, Texas is in a huge conflict right now with Washington, D.C. over basically enforcing their own laws in their own state. It's at some point in February, early March, it was February rather, it was quite a crisis situation where there were fears that Biden would nationalize the Texan National Guard or federalize the Texan National Guard. How did things get to this point?
Well, simply they got there by the absolute refusal to secure the southern border. And so the history of conservatives in the United States is to throw your hands up and complain when you don't like something. That's not fair, it's not right, it's against the law, but they don't do anything about it. But under the leadership of the governor of Texas and the attorney general, they started fighting back. They brought the Biden administration to court to challenge some of these policies that we've talked about that are clearly unlawful. And they've won several of them in the courts. And then that's not enough, and so they've continued to fight back. And so what the governor of Texas has done is say, I'm going to use Texas law enforcement officials to attempt to secure the border in a number of ways. One, erect their own physical barrier to impede entry into Texas. That consisted of using creative materials like shipping crates, stacking them up. They put some buoys in the Rio Grande River to make it hard to get around that. Of course, all these policies, the Biden administration turned around and tried to sue them, and it just goes to show that the Biden administration is not serious about securing the border. And they've also used Texas law enforcement to enforce state-level laws. So again, this goes back to the conversation about sanctuary cities. Texas can't have an immigration policy that is more restrictive or harsher than what federal law is, but they may absolutely enforce their own laws against human trafficking and smuggling, fentanyl trafficking, all of the things that are connected to unlawful migration. They are all interwoven. And when you start applying state law, you don't have to worry about what the Border Patrol is going to do, which again, the Border Patrol agents are not happy with what they're being ordered to do. That's abundantly clear. And so Texas is saying, we are going to incarcerate you for smuggling, for trafficking, for bringing fentanyl into our community, which, again, you cannot overstate the severity of the fentanyl poisoning crisis that the United States has as well. It is the #1 killer of young Americans aged 18 to 45. And so again, Texas continues to fight back. The U.S. Supreme Court told the Biden administration that they could take down the Texas-built wall, if you will. And Texas said, well, if you do that, we're going to turn right back around and rebuild it, right as soon as you're done. And thus far, despite going to court to get that permission, Biden hasn't dared even to do that because, the optics of watching Homeland Security enforcement officials tearing down a physical barrier, I think would just be absolute political suicide on that front. And so
it's an election year.
And so Texas is continuing to do it now, and it's costly. I think we were talking earlier. It's just border security is expensive, but you cannot put a price on securing the border, protecting your homeland, the sovereignty of your national identity, and all of that is jeopardized by open borders and mass unlawful migration.
Hungary knows all about that. We spent billions of euros on protecting our border, but that is also the European Union's border. We never received any thanks from Brussels or any compensation for it.
I would not hold my breath.
Yeah, we aren't. But the America First Policy Institute and the Center for Fundamental Rights, so us, started to work on a shared project last summer. It's a policy paper that deals with securing the border, with the lessons learned in Europe and in the United States, and we endeavor to offer solutions that can be adapted to the realities that are on the ground on the southern border of the United States, and that could help solve the European migration crisis as well. We have high hopes that a future Trump administration may, in fact, take up some of our recommendations, will be finalized by then. However, it begs the question, why does a great American think tank like the AFBI turn to a mid-sized European country on the issues of border protection, one of the highest priority issues for the American public and for American security?
So this is not the first time I've been asked, why does an organization that goes by America First
not even today.
Involve themselves with a bunch of Hungarians? And I say, well, I think you're lost in translation. While their official name is the Center for Fundamental Rights, it's really the Hungarian First Policy Institute as well. I've kind of rebranded them. But no, it's really about this clear shared philosophy about what border security looks like, the importance of it, and the recognition of the dangers that mass unlawful migration have. And recognizing that you have that shared vision and goal, you can learn from each other despite our dynamics being very different. Obviously, the United States is a far vaster country in size. The typical unlawful migrant population looks very different than what Hungary is typically dealing with. But those differences can still be informative. And what you see with a sustained government that puts the security and integrity of border security for their country, in this case, meaning Hungary, you see that it works. It's not just this conceptual philosophy that think tank people go around and talk to each other about. And so you saw with President Trump, the U.S. was starting to head in that direction. And then it all got upended with the abrupt change in administrations. And so using Hungary as an example, that when you have a commitment to enforcing your border laws, rejecting this premise that there is a legal right to unfettered migration, regardless of what your migration laws are, that you can get things under control. It's not easy, and it's costly, but it's necessary. And so the work that the center does on behalf of advancing policies of their administration is inspirational and can serve as a point of creative thinking, because as we've talked about before, the old playbook does not work. The problems are far more complex when it comes to unlawful migration. The networks that fuel it, including the NGOs, are more sophisticated and wealthier than ever. And so you need to start thinking creatively. The Remain in Mexico policy was sort of that first iteration of that. That was using an authority that Congress had created in 1996. And President Trump in 2018, 2019 was the first, to date only, administration to use it. And so while there are some differences in our laws, there is still policies that are working here that maybe you can adapt a little bit and go from there. And what I am hopeful is that it's not just a one-way street where we are taking all of your bounty of great ideas, but that hopefully some of the policy concepts of the America First movement may be informative as Hungary inevitably faces new challenges, either in the flow of unlawful migration, the outward pressures from regional neighbors, Brussels, NGOs. We have the same types of problems. They're a little different, but we have regional problems with the Mexican government who's not cooperating. In fact, I'd say they're very antagonistic and are contributing to it. We already discussed the NGOs, which I could go on and on about. And so again, every single element of unlawful mass migration shares common elements. And so those of us who believe in combating that and establishing secure homelands and protecting their citizens, putting their citizens first, it's a natural partnership.
Our time is running out, but let's finish on a philosophical note. Mass migration is not a new phenomenon. It's not unique to the United States. It's not unique to Europe. It's not unique to our time. It has happened to dozens of cultures, maybe hundreds of times in history. It always brought insane tragedy to the core population that was invaded by mass migration, always, without a single exception in history. Why is it that the liberals, the open society folks, the Brussels politicians, the Eurocrats, the deep state in DC, why is it that they don't understand this very simple and clear lesson of history?
The elites view themselves as above all of that. And so to some degree, they feel like in their gated communities, they don't have an unlawful migration problem. It doesn't impact them. The very expensive private schools that they send their kids to aren't receiving all of the unlawful migrants that are being trafficked across the border. Callously, many of them see these as cheap labor. Whether you are working with a work permit, which we haven't touched on this, but the Biden administration is giving the unlawful migrants work permits. They'll still take a lower wage than an American or even a new legal immigrant would take because the wages are far superior to what they would receive in their own home country. And so the elites like that cheap labor in order to pocket more of the profits for more trips to Davos or, for the uber wealthy, another yacht or, fine wine and jewelry, all of the riches of their bounty, that's a part of it. There's also a political element as well. In the United States, the US Census determines how many congressional seats each state receives, as well as how many votes their state contributes to the Electoral College when you decide presidential elections. Currently, it is a count of the total population regardless of your citizenship status. And so progressive states, again going back to the sanctuary cities, by welcoming and making their states very appealing to unlawful migrants, they are playing a longer game of impermissibly impacting the balance of power by gaining extra representation because we're counting illegal aliens instead of just citizens. And when you have a divided government like we've had in the United States for quite some time, you're working on the margins of a very small majority, every seat that can sort of fall into your team's column is important. And you see progressives recognizing this. There's a recent example of a Democrat, I think she's from New York, where Americans were fleeing New York because of their draconian COVID shutdown policies and high taxes and woke ideology they were injecting into their schools. And so they're on the verge of losing seats. And when you lose seats and you still have, the previous incumbents who held a seat that's no longer there, that means you have to go fight somebody from your own team for that. And those get very ugly. And so she said, I need more migrants in order to keep my seat. And then again, when it comes to the Electoral College, how the United States determines presidential victors. If a state like California, which already receives more electoral votes than any other state, you keep adding a few more to states that are wildly blue, it creates an enormous uphill battle for any conservative to overcome that. And so that's more of a longer term aspect of it, but it's very real, and I think it's very telling that the progressive Democrats of the United States view that aspect of it as a net positive for them, because very recently there was a vote in the United States Senate to exclude unlawful migrants from the count. Every single Democrat that was present on the floor of the United States Senate voted against that. And the only reason you would do that is if you thought that the status quo was beneficial. So I think those are the elements of it. You have a disdain for American society. You don't believe in the same American exceptionalism that is sort of in the DNA of the American conservative movement. There's the cheap labor aspect of it, and then there's the political implications as part of the longer term strategy to remake the United States into a uber progressive country.
Well, let's hope that Donald Trump turns out right. He typically does, and the best is yet to come. Thank you, Rob, for coming here to Budapest. Thank you for talking to us, and please enjoy your stay in Hungary.
Thank you so much, and thank you all again for coming out and hearing from me.